Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ami Desai.
Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome everybody here and also welcome our online audience. If you're live tweeting, just use the hashtag GPF18. I want to start by thanking Jane and the GPF team for having me moderate and organizing this panel, which I think is about one of the most important questions of our time. How do we protect the rights of the most vulnerable? And how does that question connect to all of the things that we take so granted in our lives, our phones, our food, our financial systems, the rule of law? I want this to be as interactive as possible. It's a pretty stellar group of panelists up here, and I hope they'll jump in at any time and ask each other questions as well. I don't want to take a ton of time up front, but I do just want to say that we all saw that video in mid-November on CNN with the African migrants being trafficked in Libya, and some of them were being sold for $100 or less. And in that kind of world, I think this panel is extraordinarily important, and I hope our panelists will help us learn a little bit more about the scale and the texture of human rights abuses and human trafficking. And most importantly, secondly, what we can do. The good news is, through the Clinton Global Initiative since 2005, we saw that there were more than 24 commitments made, and many of them are having a big impact. Many of our panelists have participated at CGI and participated in some of those commitments. So we do know that things can be done, and I think that's the most important thing that we can take away today. So with that being said, I want to introduce our panelists. We've got Greg Aspid from the Fair Food Program, Nancy McGuire-Choi, the COO of Polaris, Matthew Swift, the co-founder and CEO of Fortify Rights, and Oren Yakubovich, the co-founder and CEO of Videre. So without any further ado, Matthew, when you and I talked by you used the word fake news, and I was intrigued by it, and I just would love if you'd explain to the audience what you meant using those words in this context. And just tell us a little bit more about the work that you do.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ami. And just quickly, thanks to the GPF for this opportunity and for arranging this this panel. It's great to see. Fortify Rights, we're a human rights organization, so we're doing human rights documentation work primarily. But the MO of our organization is really to strengthen collective responses to human rights violations. And by that we mean doing whatever we can to support civil society organizations that are working on the front lines of abuse, in some cases just individuals, human rights defenders. And our team believes that, in order to affect change in some of these hard cases, in these cases that may seem intractable, to affect lasting change, civil society organizations, frontline human rights defenders need to have a seat at the table. They need to be driving that change forward. So we do the independent human rights monitoring because there needs to be more of that. But we're also doing the work to support civil society. With respect to fake news, in doing the documentation work, in some cases, in many cases, we're exposing violations, human rights violations, war crimes, atrocity crimes, crimes against humanity, and other human rights violations. And when we're doing that, particularly in Southeast Asia, we're in Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia, Bangladesh, but in Myanmar in particular, this fake news rhetoric has really gained some steam. And we see government officials invoke fake news whenever there's information that they find disagreeable or that somehow runs counter to their political interests. I think it's I don't want to discount the seriousness of how that catchphrase has traveled globally. But I will say that it's in some ways it's nothing new that human rights abusers would be rejecting the truth. It's what they do. And I think in that context, we feel like it's particularly important to continue to not only document human rights violations, but to strengthen the efforts of local communities to do the same.
And Nancy, building on this theme of establishing both the facts and perhaps a framework for the way forward, would you mind just telling us a little bit about the work that you and Polaris do?
Absolutely. So Polaris is an organization that is dedicated to ending human trafficking. And human trafficking is modern slavery. It is a $150 billion criminal global industry that enslaves an estimated 25 million people in forced labor and commercial sex. So what do we actually know about human trafficking? There are some key strategic insights that we've learned that inform how we think about fighting this. Number one, human trafficking is dynamic. It is constantly shape-shifting. It is diverse. There are many different permutations and forms. It exploits the vulnerable. And four, and arguably most important, it is a business. It is a high-profit, low-risk business, and our job is to flip that equation. Now, it's also been a clandestine problem, as we know, and with all clandestine challenges, it's very hard to get data on the surface area, on the scope, on the dynamics of it. And in the US context where Polaris is based, that has meant that the anti-trafficking movement for years focused downstream, in the absence of data, focused on restoring freedom to victims and survivors and helping them rebuild their lives, which is an absolutely critical piece of this fight. But it's only half the story because it doesn't actually help us combat the problem. So I want to tell a brief story about Polaris's evolution and a pivotal moment for us. So Polaris used to be one of those social service organizations that provided direct support to survivors. And in 2007, the founders had a critical experience. They were working with a woman who had just gotten out of her sex trafficking situation. And she held up a cell phone and she said, "This is what it's like to be me. These are all of the men who are trying to buy me." And she scrolled down. "Where are the messages of hope? You mean to tell me that there are organizations like yours all around the country dedicated to helping people like me, and I never knew?" And at that moment, we realized there's this fundamental disconnect in the field. There are victims and survivors all over the country, and on the other hand, service providers prepared to help, but no way to connect the two. And so Polaris began operating the National Human Trafficking Hotline to do just that, to bridge that gap in the field between service providers and victims, to help survivors get out of their situations safely, to provide a venue for community members to report tips, and to serve as the hub for the anti-trafficking movement in the US. Where are we today, 2018, 10 years later, and 40,000 human trafficking cases worked? What have we learned? Very quickly on, we started to see these patterns emerging. And we mined the data from 10 years of operating the hotline last year, and we were able to discern that there are 25 distinct types of human trafficking in the US, 25 distinct business models. And the key takeaway is that this one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work because we're talking about very different beasts. And each one needs to be fought in a segmented, targeted, data-driven way. And so today, Polaris continues to operate the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and we work upstream. So we take all of this data and information that we're learning, and we get deep into the problem to understand it, so that we can develop strategies that are data-driven, that are actionable, that engage key partners so that we can prevent and disrupt trafficking at scale.
Wow. Oren, building on or looking beyond human trafficking, can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do more broadly on atrocities?
With pleasure. So basically, the name of the talk is very relevant. We talk taking on the hard cases. So we decided to work in places where other organizations can't work, or where media can't penetrate, places where you can't just pick a phone and film stuff, places that are controlled by dictators or all kind of armed groups do not allow people really to live a normal life. And we built the organization with the mission to get to these places, working very quietly undercover and making sure we do it in a safe way, equip people in these communities with technology, mostly camera, and we're building equipment for them, working with them a lot about how you work in this environment, protect yourself, getting the information out and making sure this information will end up in places that can create a change. So if you've never heard about our name, I'm sure all of you saw our materials all over. Now, when I'm talking public, usually I'm asking everybody to sign NDAs, and I ask not to broadcast, but obviously we can't do it here. So I talk about the model in general, but not about location that we are working on, but we do work in 8 countries across the world in very hard circumstances. And the idea is to give this information to the organization and to the people and to the responsible government that can really do something with these materials. And it's all about how you manage to link the violation from the ground to a systematic change in the high level. And you can talk about it a bit later.
Thank you. And Greg, as we think about not only recognizing these abuses, but also trying to get to a place where we can prevent them, can you tell us a little bit more about the work that you do?
Sure. So I'm with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is a worker-based human rights organization that started in Florida, but now is working across the nation. And also the model that we developed is now being applied overseas. But the short answer to the question is how do you move from prosecution to prevention? And the answer is power, frankly, because counterintuitively, prosecutions seem to be kind of a muscular action. You catch the bad guy, you get the bad guy, get him behind bars. In fact, you've failed to protect people when a prosecution takes place. People have been made victims when a prosecution takes place. Prevention is the world without victims. You've created a world where crime doesn't happen. And so that's the short answer to your question, is power. For us, how did we get that power? What I'd like to do is kind of take a second to invite you to join me on a thought experiment, to give you a sense of what actually happens in the fields in this country. So imagine you're on a country road with fields on either side, and you come upon a farm stand, and you like to buy fresh, organic, local food. So you pull over, and in fact, they have, just all arrayed in front of you, all the beautiful sweet corn and watermelon and tomatoes and peaches you could ever buy. You fill your bags, you go to the cash register, and you, as the cashier is checking you out, suddenly you hear a scream coming from the field behind the register. And you look over and you see a woman in the back of a pickup truck being assaulted by her boss. Then as you start to, actually the field comes into focus, and you notice on another corner there's a worker who's on his knees, and he's trying to block the blows and the kicks of his boss. And there's the water cup tossed on the side, and he said, "Did you come here to work, or did you come here to drink water?" And at that point, your cashier turns to you and says, "That'll be $21.65. What would you do? Would anybody here buy that food? Good. No, you passed the human test. No AI in here. We are humans. We are empathetic. We don't like to buy things and consume things from those conditions. The problem is we do buy that food every day, because frankly, none of us buys food directly from farmers, and for the most part. We buy from corporations, and those corporations buy food from farmers, knowing full well the conditions that go on in the fields, and yet turning a blind eye. And this is not a condemnation of corporations or the people who work there, because if I had a room full of corporate executives, I know countless executives, if I had them here and I asked that same question, they'd say the same thing. They wouldn't buy that food for themselves. But when they act together, when they take that same decision collectively, that calculus changes. Their tolerance for abuse shoots through the roof, and they go ahead and buy it and sell it to us. So that's the reality from which we're buying. And when we were in the early 1990s in Florida, I came across the worst cases of that kind of abuse, which were human trafficking. We tried to do what anybody would do, which is bring them to justice, prosecute them. And we prosecuted case after case after case, to the point where it became known, the area where we live, with federal prosecutors, as ground zero for modern day slavery. But what we learned was you can't prosecute your way out of slavery. It doesn't happen. It's not sufficient. It's a good thing to put bad people behind bars, but it's not sufficient. You need to get to the roots, and the roots are this imbalance of power. It's the imbalance of power that allows crimes of power to take place, because the people who do these things, whether it's slavery or sexual assault in the fields, do it because they know they can get away with it. They do it because they know that the workers who are suffering will not complain. And so we had to change that. And the new theory of change we developed came from an analysis of the food industry, where we saw that the power was in fact at the top. The power in the food industry was at these consolidated multi-billion-dollar buyers who could use that volume purchasing power to drive prices down, and that gets translated into lower wages and worse conditions in the fields. So we had to find a way to harness that power to reverse its impact and improve conditions, not impoverish farm workers' lives. And so what we did, long story short, we organized consumers. We managed to secure legally binding agreements with now 14 major buyers, from Walmart to Whole Foods and McDonald's and Burger King, that say they'll only buy from growers who are in compliance with the human rights-based code of conduct. And we, and an organization that we helped establish, are the ones who determine who certify who's in compliance with that code. And so what that means now, in short, is that in the past, if a woman were assaulted in the fields, she had to make a calculus. She had to make a calculus of, can she afford to complain and lose her job and lose the food on her table for what happened to her? Or should she just kind of put her head back down and go back to work the next day, whatever comes? And 999 times out of 1,000 in the past, that's what the decision was to not complain. Today, because of the program that we've been able to establish and the agreements with the buyers, growers have to decide if they have a supervisor who's been found to be sexually harassing or sexually assaulting women in the fields, that supervisor has to be fired. The grower has to decide, can he afford to lose the business of 14 of the biggest buyers in the world and keep his supervisor, or does he have to fire the supervisor? And today, 999 times out of 1,000, that supervisor is fired. Every single complaint makes the workplace more humane. And now we've created a world that went from ground zero for modern day slavery to 0 cases of modern day slavery in just 6 years. So.
And how has the economics worked for the buyers at the very top of the pyramid?
You mean what sort of advantages and what's the business case for them? Well, it's interesting. Virtually any large buyer has a system that they'll call their CSR, approach, and they'll have a code of conduct for their suppliers, and they'll say that they'll contract with auditors to do occasional audits to look to see if the code is being complied with. There's costs involved in that, and probably the biggest cost is when, in fact, the human rights violations break through that thin veil and reach public consciousness. Then there's a human rights crisis driving a public relations crisis, which costs even more. Right? So while they've created a very thin system of auditing and codes of conduct that's really truly insufficient for stopping the human rights violations, what this does is goes beneath that veil, stops the human rights violations at the root of the problem, and so is a win-win-win situation for everybody. It's better for the worker because they're not suffering. It's better for the grower because their operation is no longer facing the risks involved with Department of Labor fines or class action lawsuits or Department of Justice actions. And it's better for the buyer because no human rights violation means no public relations crisis. So it actually achieves the end of the CSR, which doesn't work, by working to eliminate the problems of the workers at the bottom.
And Nancy, Greg told us about forming the effectiveness of forming coalitions in the agriculture industry. Would you mind just giving us a couple examples in other industries of coalitions that you think work and how you think about this issue?
Absolutely. So I just first want to echo what Greg has said and the extraordinary success that the Fair Food Program has had and a huge we work on all forms and all types of trafficking, and when we're talking about agriculture and we're talking about certain other types of trafficking, this corporate purchasing power and getting at this power structure issue is absolutely essential. So Polaris works with partners in a number of different sectors, and part of the reason for that is, as we work on all forms and all types of trafficking, we have learned from all of the data that we have analyzed that trafficking is intersecting with many different legitimate systems and industries that are unwittingly enabling it to occur. And I'll give one example, and that's the finance industry. So as we've learned, trafficking in many instances is much more networked than anybody fully realized. It is organized crime in lots of cases, and 22 out of 25 of the types of trafficking in the US use financial services industry to bank their money, move their money, invest their money. And we've been working closely with the anti-money laundering community to add a human trafficking lens to the algorithms they use to detect trafficking. And this is an incredibly promising area. First of all, financial industries are already legally required to monitor and report money laundering activities, of which human trafficking falls into that category, and where we're bringing lots of data and evidence and the lived experiences of survivors with whom we work extensively, we are baking in a much more nuanced understanding of all of these different types of trafficking. So the finance industry historically has been quite good at detecting online sex trafficking. Those transactions and tracking it has been very effective, but that is but one of the 25 types in the US alone. And so trying to work with survivors to get actionable information about how traffickers across these different types are using credit cards, are using and ruining the credit of victims, so that we can develop sufficient signals to bake in across all of these different types to be able to recognize what do financial transactions in agriculture businesses that have ethical practices, how do those differ from those that don't? And how do we detect what those signals are? And I think one of the most promising frontiers there is in machine learning, to be able to really look at the multitude of different factors and red flags that in combination really do signal that something is not quite right and needs to be investigated. So that's one. I'll point out one other, because I think it's absolutely fascinating, and it points out how important creativity is and open-mindedness in thinking about who are the unlikely allies in the fight against trafficking. So just like the finance industry, we can catch, and to echo what Greg said, we cannot prosecute our way out of this problem. That's important to do these prosecutions, but when you take a financial crimes approach, you're actually able to remove the need for victim testimony against traffickers. So I just wanted to mention that. So the second example is Polaris is engaged actively in an effort to disrupt one of the 25 types of trafficking, which is the 9,000 fake massage parlors in the US. That are anything but tranquil spa experience and exploit women from China and Korea in sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And one of the things that we found so interesting, there are so many loopholes in massage ordinances, but there are civil enforcement mechanisms that actually walk in and out, code enforcement that has the ability to just go into these businesses and inspect them. And the business owners are not especially fearful of them. They're not law enforcement. And these folks actually see what is going on, and they can document and provide information to law enforcement that can help build stronger cases down the road. They can also help victims provide information to them to connect them to services. And they can fine these businesses. These are businesses, they are sitting ducks, they have storefronts, they're in strip malls, and they can be fined. And these fines can run in hundreds to thousands of dollars. And so when we're talking about trafficking as a business, there are lots of different creative ways to get at the problem that isn't, hanging everything on new policies or law enforcement, because the magnitude of the problem is so significant that we've got to really look to creative places. So I wanted to mention code enforcement as an unlikely and really important ally.
Oren, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned that your work is, you think of it as being more focused on tackling the systems that enable abuses of power rather than focusing individually on the person who's perpetrating an abuse of power.
Yeah, I think it's all coming to impact, right? We all want to create an impact. Anyone on the stage and before want to create an impact, and to create a long-lasting impact, you have to understand the system quite well and what are the drivers that are behind the violations. So it's not about, if you want to change, it's not about the women that have been trafficked, it's not about the guy that's taking corruption, it's not about the guy that's stealing the election, it's about which system there are in place that you want to influence and change for the long term. I'll give you one example. In one of the countries we're working, we're doing work on corruption, so we did spread on the ground undercover equipment with vendors and people that are being actually extorted for money on a daily basis. And we talked about the big project, long time, you collect all the information, you have amazing amount of information of corruption, you're analyzing the whole structure, you know exactly who's controlling the money, who's controlling the system. But what you do with it, you can either take to court the guys that are taking the money, and you can do it, but what you want to do actually is look at the system that should regulate this phenomenon. What the corruption unit, or what the people in the government, or what the structure, that if they were functioning quite well, what we saw on the ground will not happen. And this is who you want to tackle. So you use the materials from the ground, the violation, the evidence, to really walk up the system to understand what is there that you want to influence. Because if you're going to take the guy that took the corruption back to court, or the smuggler, you didn't change anything. Another one going to come out and do the same thing, because systems tend to go back to their own old balance. So you have to map very, very well who are the actors, what is the drivers, what you want to achieve, and then back engineer the whole project to get the right information in the packaging. And we have very creative ways to do it in your world, in our world, using technology, using all kinds of data, big data, small data, systems to be able to get the whole thing, and then use it to really create something that is much more systematic. So it's never about the violation. You focus down, you don't see the horizon, and you're never going to be able to change the reality. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm humbling saying impact. I think impact is something that's very hard to achieve. We're hardly really achieving it. Talking about long systemic impact. We're talking about years of work that need to be done by a variety of organizations to really create a change, and you have to be patient. And I guess it's a very good forum for a lot of donors to get to buy into the fact that you have to invest in places and methodologies and organizations for long term to be able really to see in the end returns your investment. And we usually tend to work very fast to try to get it's very hard to achieve.
Well, one of the great examples of taking a long time to build something, but then being able to have a great impact, I think, is the work that Greg and the folks have been doing on shifting what they've been focused on in the agriculture industry to the garments industry in Bangladesh. Maybe we can hear a little bit more about that.
So the model, that we developed in Florida is pretty simple. It's saying that the powers that be in the structure of the food industry need to change the priorities by which they buy food. If they include human rights and condition their purchases on compliance with human rights, that will change the conditions at the bottom and avoid people becoming victims. And it was a theory of change that made sense to us. We managed to be able to try that theory of change out, and it against reality, and it worked. It worked beyond our wildest dreams, frankly. So we've had 6 seasons doing that, and the results have been fantastic. It caught the attention of workers in other places. So there are workers in Bangladesh who've been fighting for more safe workplaces for years. I mean, the collapses and the burning down to the ground of factories in Bangladesh are legion. The history is horrible. And Rana Plaza just celebrated the 5th anniversary of its collapse, which killed 1,200 workers in a moment, injured 2,500 more, orphaned countless children whose parents went to work there that morning. And it happened simply because the workers who survived talked about it. They said that they could see the cracks in the walls in the building that morning. They didn't want to go in. But they couldn't afford to complain because, again, they would lose their job. They did that same calculus. And so they went into the building, and most of them didn't come out, at least not whole. And so that caused so much, such a public relations crisis for the apparel industry that they finally had to accede to the demands of unions in Bangladesh, unions in Europe, and allies here in the United States who had been pushing for a fair food program style approach to addressing safety issues there. And basically it's the same thing. They got the especially brands in Europe to sign on to say they'll only buy from suppliers who meet the safety codes of their code of conduct. And the workers will be able to set up an independent monitoring organization that will determine which factories are in compliance. And then if factories are out of compliance, purchases will stop, but the brands will actually put money behind fixing them and bringing them up to compliance. So it's not simply closing them down, but helping them come back in. And now I think they just renewed for another 5 years, and it's saving lives. And so, imagine everybody here goes to work. A lot of people here probably have children. Imagine going to work, being too afraid to complain because you think the building you're working in is going to collapse on you. And what happens when your kids never see you again? That's what happened on a regular basis in Bangladesh. And that's not happening anymore, thanks to this approach. So this paradigm, it's really a new paradigm, is what it is. CSR, corporate social responsibility, has been the dominant paradigm for, in theory, protecting human rights at the base of supply chains for 3 decades. But it's failed. I mean, I'm not going to say anything nice about it. It's failed. And it's failed at the cost of people's lives, at the cost of people being sexually assaulted, at the cost of people being held against their will, at the cost of people dying in these accidents. And those failures are enough. We now have a paradigm that actually works. And so where CSR has failed, WSR, worker-driven social responsibility, this new model that is designed by workers to protect their own lives, as opposed to corporate social responsibility, which is designed to change consumers' perceptions of the brands in whose supply chains human rights violations take place, needs to occupy more and more space in corporate supply chains around the world, because of each inch of space it occupies is more people whose lives are being protected.
Matthew, while we're on the topic of Bangladesh, I know your organization has done a lot with the Rohingya. It'd be great to just hear a little bit more about your thoughts on what's happening there in Myanmar and what you think the way forward is.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I guess I should just say it was great to see the panel this morning, and I think they covered all of the really important issues. It was also great to hear Kofi Annan speak a bit about his role on the advisory commission, which there was a period of time that we were very worried that the Annan Commission was going to essentially be used as a tool by the authorities in Myanmar to further whitewash the atrocities, and he steered it in the right direction, and it turned out to be a very useful exercise. I guess just one thing, a couple of things that in addition to what's already been talked about with regard to the Rohingya or Rohingya, both pronunciations are generally accepted. One thing that I think is worth clarifying is that the government of Myanmar right now is attempting to destroy the Rohingya population, and when perpetrators are doing that, there's a word for that. There's a crime, and that crime is genocide. And this is a term that gets skirted around quite a lot in our work, and certainly among diplomats, and certainly among other members of the international community. And there are a few concerns with this. One is that there is a risk of getting into terminology wars, which is not totally helpful. With people saying it's genocide, no, it's ethnic cleansing, no, it's crimes against humanity, it's this, it's that. And so I think the terminology warfare is not particularly helpful. But if we are going to live in a world where we can prevent the crime of genocide, we have to be able to diagnose it when it's happening. And we have no misunderstandings right now about what's going on in Myanmar. We've been working on the front lines of violations there for some time. To pick up on the issue of prevention, which was mentioned up here, going back a few years, working with members of the Rohingya community and members of other communities, the writing was on the wall. There were very serious violations taking place. We knew something very significant was going to happen. Even a year before Rohingya militants had a public showing, we were at Harvard University and other places talking about the risk that would be the new landscape of abuse. But I guess just to add to it, in our view, the crime of crimes is being perpetrated right now, and it's being perpetrated in front of the world. We heard a bit about the systematic rape. We heard a bit about Myanmar military going in and burning villages down. Just to contextualize that a little bit, the military is not just going in and burning villages down. They're going in with RPG, shoulder-fired RPG, rocket-propelled grenades, and they're firing on civilian communities, razing the entire villages, separating men and boys from women and girls. Women and girls are being taken and have been taken and raped in staggering numbers. Men and boys in some cases are being executed. We've documented full-on massacres, hundreds upon hundreds of people in villages all throughout a large swath of territory in northern Rakhine State. Mass graves, infant children being thrown into fires, infant children being thrown into rushing rivers, huge casualties. So I guess just to emphasize, the seriousness of what's happening, the government, the authorities in Myanmar right now are perpetuating this dehumanizing rhetoric. And there's been next to no accountability, as Ian Levine from Human Rights Watch mentioned this morning. And in that context, where perpetrators are not facing any sort of accountability, that's a green light for continued mass killings. And we've seen the authorities test the waters and move it forward. In terms of progress, we've recognized over the years that a lot of people have talked about the Rohingya situation. Not as many people have actually talked to Rohingya about their situation. And so one of the things that we do, and we don't advertise our technical support as much as we do our independent investigations, but one of the things we're trying to do is to convene Rohingya leaders so that they can come together and discuss for themselves what they want to achieve, how they want to achieve it. They have very difficult questions about, difficult conversations about what's realistic and what's not. It's very healthy. And in our view, that's one of the ways forward. So that's been a glimmer of hope, I think, in an otherwise atrocious situation.
Can I ask you a question? What you will done differently in terms of what you know now, and you saw the violation happening in 2016, and we know what's happening in 2012. What you will expect the international community to do, which action to take before that we have not seen that can be effective? Because I think that's what we're always very smart about after things are happening, but what can be done before? And just the second one to tie into the whole circle, because these people that escape to Bangladesh will find themselves as slaves in the factories that are in Bangladesh and other places in the world. So it's all kind of a whole circle of violation that feeding each other that we are not stopping and just then have to bring more support and more money in to take care of it. So sorry for the...
Yeah, I think one thing that could have prevented the last round of mass violence would have been a meaningful effort internationally toward accountability. Because what happened was in October, it was on October 9th, 2016, Rohingya militants, a ragtag group of men and boys, as I'm sure you're aware, attacked a few police stations in Rakhine State. This was unprecedented. They had mostly spears and knives, and they murdered 9 police officers. And in response to that, the military burned down villages, committed mass killings, again, threw infants into fires, things of that nature. And there was a deafening silence in the international community. We couldn't, the Security Council was not meeting to talk about it. The governments around the world were not paying attention to it the way that they should have. Had there been, at that point, a meaningful push towards international accountability, towards international justice, and by that I mean, as was mentioned this morning, a referral to the International Criminal Court, even the threat of a referral could have had a preventative effect back then. But that didn't happen, and so when August 25th, 2017 came around, militants attacked again, and the military moved in with enormous force in all 3 townships of northern Rakhine State. So I think it was the absence of international action that essentially paved the way for many of the atrocities that have happened since.
I just throw, basically it's the same thing in every system. People who will do things, will do crimes against others, do them because they know they can get away with it. That's it. And that there won't be consequences. And so what you have to do is set up systems where they will get caught. They know, and before they act, they themselves do their own calculation. They know they'll get caught, and they know that there will be consequences, and the consequences will be worse than anything they get from doing the crime. That's just how it works,
But we need to understand what they're thinking, because I actually don't think that people that are doing crime think they're making crimes. A lot of times they have excuse to themselves why they're doing it. Like any dictator would think that he's protecting his people from other people. So kind of understanding them, I guess, and then find out how you eliminate it by putting system in place that stop them or hold them accountable.
Right. But it is accountability that matters, because in the end they will respond to that. And it's a very simple thing. Like in this country we have a tax system. How many people here would pay if they thought that they could get away without paying taxes? How many people here honestly would pay all their taxes?
Hands in the air?
Yeah, a couple, right? So the point is, we actually have achieved what they call voluntary compliance, in a very high level of voluntary compliance, because we put a lot of resources into the IRS, which will, in the mind of taxpayers, will catch you if you try to avoid paying taxes, and then they'll penalize you with interest and everything else, and the penalty is worse than trying to avoid paying taxes. So people do it, right? And it's just where the priorities are, and the government needs money to function, so there's a priority in revenue. Accountability in this case wasn't a high priority for the international community. It didn't happen, and what happened afterwards is a result.
I think what's said about it, that the Rohingya probably have you cannot monetize them. They don't have power, they're not counting, and where we usually tend to act, and we see something, and sorry, I didn't want to hurt any Rohingya, but it's really the problem with weak communities and that have nothing on their leverage to really influence the global economy or the global diplomacy. And this is where we are failing again and again, and we're not kind of getting enough the information and knowledge or the understanding about how the systems are working and how limited we are in our work. And everybody in the room here, when talking about philanthropy and about NGOs and about compared to the lot of international pressure, international dynamic that is happening in this space, and we have to get it into account much more when we are planning our project, when we aren't giving our money, when we are trying to do stuff. So we're subject to all kind of forces that you're not even aware that are working around us and holding any progress to really happen.
And is there, just broadening it a bit, what's the role for technology? What are the upsides and the downsides? It's a question for each of you. You've mentioned it in different ways, but it'd be great to hear a little bit more.
Sure. Let me give 2 positive examples. And I think, generally speaking, the role of technology in the fight against trafficking is to reach people at scale, including as a deterrent, as a prevention measure, and also as a disruption measure. So we run the hotline, which is in itself a significant technology operation that is both phone and 4 digital signals. And about 2 years ago, we were piloting, before we had run text messaging 24/7, we were piloting text messaging, and we heard from a woman who texted from the front seat of a car that was driving down a highway, and she said, "I just met up with an old friend who I hadn't seen in a while and told him that I was planning to move to a new city, and he said, oh, I'm actually headed there, let me give you a ride." And a couple hours into the ride, he said, "So here's what's going to happen when we arrive. You're going to be selling yourself to a bunch of different men, and if you don't, there will be consequences." She had a cell phone. She was in the front seat of the car, and she was able to find the text line for the hotline and start texting with an advocate. And she was able to very discreetly look outside and notice the exit signs and be able to identify roughly where she was. The advocate was able to identify. And then she was able to discreetly look over at the steering wheel and notice the logo and get the make and model of the car. And by the time they had gotten to their destination, they were met by a police escort that were able to effectively prevent this trafficking situation before it happened. So that's one example of a way in which, in a very positive way, technology can be used to reach people, and particularly text messages, where many people in traffic situations do have some access to a cell phone. A different kind of example that I find really interesting and potentially promising comes out of a Microsoft-backed project to deter sex trafficking using chatbots. So a potential sex buyer would be on an online platform like a Backpage, which, by the way, was just shut down about a month ago, which is a big deal. But there are many online sex marketplaces, of course. And the chatbot is very lifelike, posing as a minor offering to sell sex. And at the point of sale, there will then be a message that will flash on the screen that will say to the effect of, buying sex from another human being has long-term, lasting, traumatic consequences for this person, and you may be contacted by law enforcement, and here's where you can get help. And the beauty of approaches like that is that they can reach tens of thousands of people at once. They can start to flip this equation where right now, if we're talking about market conditions, demand is a very real thing, and create a widespread deterrence, or at least create fear where right now there's just general impunity.
In our case, without social media and the internet, we wouldn't have been able to do what we did. What we had to do back in 2001 when we launched the campaign for fair food was, take it back to the farm stand thought experiment, and you had the corporations that buy that food without really being concerned about the conditions in the field right behind it. Our job was to make those corporations act like human beings. That's what it was to make them act like you, right? So, and you can't do that easily, in case anybody's ever tried. So what we had to do was find the pressure that we could build around the corporations to make them make their decisions differently, and that was with consumers. But we're acting from a farmer community in South Florida that is one of the poorest communities in the country. If we had had our theory of change 10 years earlier, I'm pretty sure we would have hit a brick wall, because we would have had to done that face-to-face across the country, and it wouldn't have had the power. Instead, we hit it just at the time the internet was coming up, just at the time that social media started to come up. And it allowed us to send our message and speak to college students across the country, to people of faith, to unions, community organizations across the country, and build enough power to actually move corporations to sign binding legal agreements to do something they've never done before, which is a very difficult thing to do. And those agreements gave us the power we needed to move from prosecution to prevention. But without social media, I don't think it would have been possible.
So we have innovation department that we developed quite early because we want to be in the forefront of technology and use what we can and make sure the technology is serving us. And technology is not good or bad, it's what you do with it. So we're doing a few things. So first of all, we are working with hidden cameras. So we do develop equipment, we modify equipment when we're working with people on the ground, and we are not filming anything. It's all our employees are local from the community, that we train them, we work with them, they give a lot of security training, but also we know what they're wearing, how they're acting, where they're walking, what they're carrying. And we know how to put this technology into their devices to be able to document what usually you can't do without allow them to be safe and without notice doing stuff in their environment. I think technology also, the thing is that, we're talking about closing spaces, and Kofi Annan talked about it yesterday, about how it's becoming more and more challenging to work in this environment because government is controlling much better what's happening. They know well who we are and who are the activists, and many of the human rights defenders organizations will not get access or visa ability to get to location, and technology is being served to do that, and to monitor human rights activists and what we are doing, and that's why we have to be very careful. This is one of the reasons that I'm not talking about where we are working, but it's not only public. So really, if you want to know where we are, so come talk with me after. But we're not talking about it because we know that with the moment they know who you are, where you're working, they track your phone, they track your communication. It's very easy to figure out where you are. So technology can serve us and do a lot of good, but also bring a lot of challenges that we have to overcome. It's going to be very, very difficult to work as we move forward the way we're working today.
I would just bring up Facebook. You know, in Myanmar, in Southeast Asia, Facebook is the platform that most people use to access the internet. Many people in Southeast Asia, particularly in Myanmar, their only interaction with the internet is via Facebook. And there's actually, in some cases, no knowledge that there is a wider internet out there. But Facebook in Myanmar has been a menace. It's been a platform that's been used to incite violence. It's been a platform that's been used to propagate hate speech. And the company has, in my view, in our view, the company has deserves the negative press that they've been getting in Myanmar because they've really not responded to very serious situations the way that a responsible company should. Hopefully the pressure will change that. Our team has received death threats and faced other types of threats on Facebook. And in some cases it took weeks or months to get posts taken down. And the only reason we were able to get them taken down is because we went to one person who went to another person who went to another person who knew an executive. To actually go through the systems they have doesn't work. So that Facebook has a lot, I think a lot to account for in Myanmar in particular. That said, two positive examples quickly. There was a case last year of extremist monks who went into a local market in Yangon to evict a Muslim trader who had his little shop set up there. And they filmed it with their phones and then they put it on Facebook. And they did not expect to get the response they received. The response they received was actually thousands of messages of support to the person that they had evicted. And in some cases, people actually found the individual, gave him donations, gave his family donations. So it was this outpouring of love and peace for somebody who had faced the wrath of some of these extremist monks. So that was quite positive. Another example is at our organization, Fortify Rights, we had received some very disturbing footage of Myanmar army soldiers torturing some ethnic Palang men in the north of the country. And very carefully, we put together a 60-second film to show what the authorities had done to these men. And also we were concerned, we had other concerns about, the whereabouts and well-being of the people who were in the film. After much deliberation, we put out this short film on social media, and it went viral almost instantly, hundreds of thousands of views on Facebook overnight. And for all of the press releases and reports and other documentation that we put out there that in some cases a lot of governments will just ignore or not respond to publicly. In this case, the government of Aung San Suu Kyi agreed to investigate, and it was unprecedented, but the government of, the Myanmar military put out a press release saying that they would investigate. And that was the authorities understanding the power of social media and the power of film and realizing we have to do something in this situation. So that was quite positive.
Well, I feel like we could spend the entire day here with the four of you. Since we're at the Global Philanthropy Forum, I just wanted to ask each of you what you think the role of philanthropy is on these issues. What do you think everyone in this room can go out and do after this panel?
So thank you for the question. I was waiting for it. I think, we all work in human rights and kind of in a certain aspect of it. And for me, human rights is the foundation of a building. Like you don't build building without strong foundation. You can invest in health and in education, but if it's all sitting and standing on a very weak foundation, it will fall. And somehow the money that been spent on human rights is so much less than the rest of the sectors. And I'm asking why. Do you not care about your investment? Do you want to invest in stuff that will fall after? So I'm thinking, putting money in human rights in the essence of what humanity is about is extremely important, and in prevention. Because if we're going to fail prevention, we're going to deal anyway with what we're dealing after. So we're going to have to bring money to refugees and take care of food program and all kind of stuff if we have not prevent the situation. So why not moving and thinking and start thinking as the panel before was mentioning a different way and how to think about prevention and about the foundation and about how we're stopping it. I don't understand why the sustainable UN goal around peace, and it's only 16 and not first, and it's starting with hunger and with poverty. That, of course, are important, but if you fix human rights problem, you don't have to deal with the rest of the stuff. So I think we have to change the way we're thinking about the whole arena.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would just add that, every year, almost like clockwork, there are a couple of really well-placed op-eds talking about how the human rights movement is either dead or failing. And I think the one thing that unites a lot of those opinion pieces that tend to crop up is they fail to acknowledge the nuts and bolts of the human rights movement. I mean, there are huge numbers of local civil society organizations working on the front lines of abuse in very difficult situations with very limited resources. And these are human rights organizations. And that is the human rights movement. And we get to see on a daily basis, and we're inspired on a daily basis by that work that takes place. And I can't imagine a world in which there would be no value in documenting the truth and establishing the facts, particularly now with the rise in the fake news rhetoric. So I would love to see more investment in human rights documentation in particular, and efforts to ensure that local civil society can credibly and effectively document those violations.
I'll add an easy answer and a harder one. The easy answer, and the important, it's critically important, is to invest in data and to look upstream. We cannot legislate and prosecute our way out of this problem. Those are all key pieces. But we need systems change thinking and investments in it. The harder one is to do some real soul searching on our own responsibilities. Because we've learned about all of the different systems that touch human trafficking, we need to think about the food that we're eating, the services and products that we're consuming, and the role that each of us can play in nudging these systems forward, or systemic change, so that in a generation we won't need to be pulling survivors one by one out of their situations. So please don't make the mistake of leaving fighting human trafficking to the experts, to the people who do it full time. And I think this goes for all of us here. Don't leave it to law enforcement. Please join us. Thank you.
I would just add, I agree with everything, and would just add that when you have identified a program that has done a systems, analysis and change, and that works, that has created new outcomes, that has prevented human rights violations from happening, fund it. Fund success. Well, the weirdest thing is, a lot of times you'll get to the point where you are successful, you have a proven program, and the funding will move on somewhere else. And I understand the need to fund new ideas. That's how we got funded at the beginning. But don't drop the ones that work. Help them expand, because they are a solution to help more people get out of these problems that we're talking about and stop living in fear and stop living under the shadow of, going to work every day and wondering what their boss is going to do to them that day. So fund things that work.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists. I think you've pretty adequately proven that the human rights movement is anything but failing. And I want to thank you each for the work that you and your organizations do. And again, thanks to Jane and the GPF for organizing this panel. And I hope this conversation will continue, that this isn't just 4 people on stage and everyone listening, that this is an interactive process that continues into the future. Thank you.
Thank you.